Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to speak on C-42 and obviously have some concerns with regard to the issues of privacy and the fact that the government introduced this on the last day of sitting in June, on the 17th. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, we're all concerned about security issues. We're all concerned, though, about balancing that with privacy issues. And obviously, this issue of providing information to a foreign government is done when a plane lands in a foreign territory. So if, in fact, a Canadian were to fly from Toronto to New York, information would be provided. However, Mr. Speaker, what is really being proposed here is that if I were to fly from Toronto to Vancouver and this flight were to go over American territory, the personal information, the name, details of that passenger would be given to American authorities. That seems to me to be not only outrageous, but a violation certainly of Canadian sovereignty and the rights of Canadians. And therefore, the question has been raised in this House on a number of occasions regarding C-42 as to why did we negotiate such a bad arrangement in which the Americans basically will have a free hand in knowing who is going to be traveling over American territory without ever landing there. And in fact, they can keep this up to 99 years depending on the situation. So that obviously is of concern. It certainly seems to me to weaken Canadian sovereignty, and obviously the divulging of that information, Mr. Speaker, I think is something which is unprecedented. And again, that means that anyone who is going to get on a flight anywhere in this country, just because it goes over American territory, would have that information disclosed to American authorities. And certainly the Assistant Privacy Commissioner, when she came to the Standing Committee on Transportation, noted that back in May and was concerned about the fact that from 7 days to 99 years this information could be kept. Now that seems to be highly excessive, and obviously not only is the information going to be kept, Mr. Speaker, it's not just on the issue of security, but it could be used for other purposes. And that I think is the big question. What other purposes is in fact being used? Not just for that. It could be used, for example, maybe law enforcement issues. It could be used for immigration issues. So it's not necessarily for the purpose of which it is intended. And that is where I think many Canadians have concerns about that. The Liberal Party in the Transport Committee made three, I think, important amendments to the legislation, which I'll talk about a little later. But again, it's still this issue of sovereignty. It's still the issue that we are turning over information simply by flying over someone else's territory without ever landing. This Aeronautical Act, as you know, Mr. Speaker, also we have, of course, the legislative authority in this to create the no-fly list. I've never understood this no-fly list, because we're saying that people can't fly, but you could board a passenger ship, a train, whatever, automobile. Apparently only a threat if you're in the air. You're not a threat if you're on a major ship or on a train, etc., etc. I don't know, if you're not allowed to fly, why are you able to take other modes of transportation? I guess they only think that people who fly are going to be potential terrorists. The fact is that Canadian Airlines, as we know, disclose information when they are going to another country. But again, this is the flyover issue, and this is, I think, the crux of the matter. Canadians do value their privacy. And we tend, it seems, in this country to be asked a lot for private information. I'm sure, you know, Mr. Speaker, when people go to a store, they're asked sometimes for their SIN number. Well, the SIN number is only given for government programs. It's not given because somebody wants to buy a piece of furniture. And yet, I've had constituents, I know people who have been asked for their SIN number. People are asked for so much information which is not germane to the issue at hand. And again, this is a situation with regard to the flyover that I certainly, and a number of my constituents certainly have voiced concerns over. On the committee, Mr. Chairman, the Liberal Party made three amendments. The first was the House of Commons be required to conduct a review of these measures 2 years after the date coming into force, and then every 5 years. And I think that oversight provision obviously is important. It's been done in other legislation, and I think it's something, Mr. Speaker, that should be there. The second, of course, is this data transfer will be limited to the the U.S. in legislation. The original version basically said it could be Border Council to any government, so it's going to be only to the United States. And thirdly, airlines and travel agents will be required by Canadian law to inform passengers of this impending data transfer before a ticket is purchased. I think that is also important because I think Canadians need to know what is going to be happening if, in fact, they board an airplane and they're flying over a particular territory in the United States, and it's going to be given away. The Privacy Commissioner, as I said, has certainly pointed out concerns with regard to this. And this bill that is before the House basically does one thing. It amends the Aeronautical Act to allow an operator of an aircraft that is going over, in this case, the United States, to provide information. And again, the amount of information given to the United States clearly is of concern, and I would hope when the Prime Minister is in Washington at the end of the week that this issue is raised with the President of the United States. Obviously, the Americans unfortunately have this impression that terrorism has somehow emanated from this country. We all remember then Senator Hillary Clinton's comments about the porous border and these terrorists that 9/11 had come across from Canada. That, of course, was not true. I think we have to be concerned about Senator Lieberman of Connecticut's comments yesterday, again, that the northern border of the United States is more porous than the southern border. Again, this impression continuing, and of course, we seem to play into this by suggesting then that we have to provide this kind of information to the Americans. The issue, of course, is that when we usually deal with aviation regulations, we're talking about domestic regulations. In this case, it's actually a security program dealing with another country. And I think, again, that the collection of information is paramount here. And again, this is unusual because it is not for domestic purposes. It's dealing with a foreign country. So sovereignty, I think, is important. In international law, of course, clearly sovereignty of a country extends into airspace. But again, what we are doing is we're abrogating, I think, that by allowing information to be given simply because, and maybe there's a weather change. What happens is they say, now this route will have to go, and the passenger may not know that in advance, obviously. Privacy, citizens' rights are at stake, et cetera, et cetera. There is, of course, Mr. Speaker, this whole issue that we are, again, trying to look in any legislation at a balance between security and privacy, but it would appear, Mr. Speaker, that the government has simply caved in when it comes to this, and had it not been for my Liberal colleagues on the Transport Committee, in fact, we would have had a pretty wide open situation for turning over information to the United States. That obviously is a concern. There's obviously issues about security at airports. And I don't know, Mr. Speaker, that everyone feels any safer because they go through these scanners at the airports. I can tell you at Narita Airport in Japan, where they do the security initially is way before you get to the airport. Outside, ringing that airport, they check for your passport. They do the metal detectors under the vehicles. They come on board. They actually do that in advance because we seem to wait till people come into the airport and somehow make them feel good as we shake down some elderly individual or some 15-year-old kid, instead of dealing with the real practical reasons and needs for security. So again, this legislation is flawed. It is obvious that these amendments, although they enhance the legislation, still I have concerns with regard to the issue of turning over any personal information to a foreign government. In this case, when you're simply flying over, we all understand if you're landing there, but certainly flying over to me seems to be very questionable at best, and particularly if that information is not being used strictly for that purpose, but again, it could be used for other purposes, which again, Canadians wouldn't necessarily know what they'd be used for. And that, I think, raises concerns. And why, Mr. Speaker, would they be able to keep it up to 99 years? That, again, is a concern. So, Mr. Speaker, I said the legislation has received some improvements because of these amendments, but again, it's still the issue of should we be caving into the United States when we're flying over and giving out personal information, which, again, is not done elsewhere. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The Honourable Member for Western Arctic.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague in the Liberal Party, a man I know who has grave concerns about privacy issues, and I want to thank him for standing up and speaking on this. Although he is not on the Transport Committee, I think he, in his role, would understand some of the issues that are surrounding this very well. You know, in June 2007, the European Union Data Protection Supervisor wrote a letter giving 4 concerns about these developments of these data transfers. One of them was the use of the letter by the U.S. to avoid binding treaties, and Canada's overflight exemption is based on a diplomatic letter of understanding. Now, my colleague has had a fair experience in foreign affairs. Do you think we should be turning over Canadians' data, Canadians' private information on the basis of a diplomatic letter of understanding? Is this a situation that just is fraught with hazard for Canadians?
The Honourable Member for Richmond Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable colleague who I've had the pleasure to work with for many years, not only in this House, but also in municipal government in the past. I think he raises a very important point with regard to the European Union. There's no question that to base it on a diplomatic note and the fact that, again, we don't know what the purpose other than information is given, but it can be used in the issue of law enforcement, it could be used for immigration purposes. That, I think, is far too broad, and as the honourable colleague well knows, a diplomatic note alone is not sufficient in terms of the security that we need as Canadians, and again, in balancing this privacy issue. So again, that is something which, again, would have been helpful had we been able to get that into the bill. But again, Mr. Speaker, I know legislation is never perfect, but better to have a bill which addresses these concerns rather than, again, this bill was introduced on the last day of Parliament, and now suddenly here we are in the beginning of February, and we're rushing this through, and I wonder whose agenda this is. Is this the government's agenda or someone else's in this case? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments, the Honourable Member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, it appears as though the Conservatives gave away the store negotiating with the United States on this particular agreement, because when you look at the at the committee hearings, Mark Salter, who's a professor of University at University of Ottawa, presented, and he had complimented Canada having set a high global standard for the use of the PNR, in particular with the Canada-EU agreement in relation to PNR matters. He said the agreement's praised by both Canadian and European data protection authorities because it has specific time periods for the disposal of data, not the 40 years that this other agreement with the Americans have. It limits the data's use, and it limits in particular the individualization of that information. The information is rendered anonymous, which allows the security services to build up the profile without attaching it to any one particular individual. This has become one of the global standards for international treaties on PNR agreements, and we're moving away from that high standard with the passage of this legislation. So I'd ask the member whether he agrees with Professor Mark Salter of the University of Ottawa, who presented to the committee and gave a very, very good argument as to why the Canadians shouldn't be looking at what they signed with the Europeans as opposed to what they're now proposing with the Americans, where they just rolled over.
The Honourable Member for Richmond Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had an opportunity to review some of the testimony and Professor Salter's comments, and it certainly jives very much with the Privacy Commissioner's concerns, and even worse than the member said, because in fact it will be held from 7 days to 99 years. And I think, again, that what the member has pointed out is, and what the professor indicated very strongly, is that that's more of what we should be looking at rather than giving the store away. And again, I say, Mr. Speaker, and I say this to the member, when the Prime Minister goes to Washington on Friday, this should be, in fact, one of the priorities, because, again, we keep giving away information for purposes other than what it should be used for. And again, I agree with the honourable member, that was testimony that, unfortunately, had it been implemented as one of the amendments to the legislation, would have been most helpful, and again provide the kind of security and the kind of privacy that I think Canadians would expect from their government. Thank you.